Camp Pivika. It's me, Kelly, camp director. Something you might not know about me is that I really love to read. And so I thought it might be a nice idea to share one of my favorite stories with you. And it's not just going to be me sharing the story. We're going to have a lot of the staff and volunteers that you know will come in every Sunday, and we're going to do a recording and read a story with you. So I love all kinds of stories. One of my favorites is the BFG by Roald Dahl. So if you haven't heard this story, you're in for a treat. If you have heard it, it's one of those stories that I think you can hear several times and still enjoy it. I know I've read it to Sydney, I read it to myself when I was younger, and now I'm really excited to read it to you. So, without further ado, we are going to start the BFG. This chapter is called The Witching Hour. Sophie couldn't sleep. A brilliant moonbeam was slanting through a gap in the curtains. It was shining right on her pillow. The other children in the dormitory had been asleep for hours. Sophie closed her eyes and lay quite still. She tried very hard to doze off. It was no good. The moonbeam was like a silver blade slicing through the room onto her face. The house was absolutely silent. No voices came up from downstairs. There were no footsteps on the floor above either. The window behind the curtain was wide open, but nobody was walking on the pavement outside. No cars went by on the street. Not the tiniest sound could be heard anywhere. Sophie had never known such a silence. And here's a picture of little Sophie in her bed. Perhaps, she told herself, this was what they called the witching hour. The witching hour, somebody had once whispered to her, was a special moment in the middle of the night when every child and every grown-up was in a deep, deep sleep, and all the dark things came out from hiding and had the world to themselves. The moonbeam was brighter than ever on Sophie's pillow. She decided to get out of bed and close the gap in the curtains. You got punished if you were caught out of bed after lights out, even if you said you had to go to the bathroom. That was not accepted as an excuse, and they punished you just the same. But there was no one about now. Sophie was sure of that. She reached out for her glasses that lay on the chair beside her bed. They had steel rims and very thick lenses, and she could hardly see a thing without them. She put them on, then she slipped out of bed and tiptoed over to the window. When she reached the curtains, Sophie hesitated. She longed to duck underneath them and lean out of the window to see what the world looked like now that the witching hour was at hand. She listened again. Everything, everywhere, it was deathly still. The longing to look out became so strong she couldn't resist it. Quickly, she ducked under the curtains and leaned out of the window. In the silvery moonlight, the village street she knew so well became completely different. The houses looked bent and crooked, like houses in a fairy tale. Everything was pale and ghostly and milky white. Across the road, she could see Mrs. Rance's shop, where you bought buttons and wool and bits of elastic. It didn't look real. There was something dim and misty about that, too. Sophie allowed her eye to travel further and further down the street. Suddenly, she froze. There was something coming up the street on the opposite side. It was something black, something tall and black, something very tall and very black and very thin. It wasn't a human. It couldn't be. It was 4 times as tall as the tallest human. It was so tall, its head was higher than the upstairs windows of the houses. Sophie opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat, like her whole body, was frozen with fright. This was the witching hour, all right. The tall black figure was coming her way. It was keeping very close to the houses across the street, hiding in the shadowy places where there was no moonlight. On and on it came, nearer and nearer, but it was moving in spurts. It would stop, then it would move on, then it would stop again. But what on earth was it doing? Aha! Sophie could now see what it was up to. It was stopping in front of each house. It would stop and peer into the upstairs window of each house in the street. It actually had to bend down to peer into the upstairs windows. That's how tall it was. It would stop and peer in. Then it would slide on to the next house and stop again, and peer in, and so on, all along the street. It was much closer now, and Sophie could see it more clearly. Looking at it carefully, she decided it had to be some kind of person. Obviously, it was not a human, but it was definitely a person. A giant person, perhaps. Sophie stared hard across the misty moonlit street. The giant, if that's what he was wearing a long black cloak. In one hand, he was holding what looked like a very long, thin trumpet. In the other hand, he had a large suitcase. The giant has stopped now right in front of Mr. and Mrs. Gucci's house. The Gucci's had a green grocer shop in the middle of the high street, and the family lived above the shop. The two Gucci children slept in the upstairs front room. Sophie knew that. The giant was peering through the window into the room where Michael and Jane Gucci were sleeping. From across the street, Sophie watched and held her breath. She saw the giant step back a pace and put the suitcase down on the pavement. He bent over and opened up the suitcase. He took something out of it. It looked like a glass jar, one of those square ones with a screw top. He unscrewed the top of the jar and poured what was in it into the long end of the trumpet thing. Sophie watched, trembling. She saw the giant straighten up again, and she saw him poke the trumpet in through the open upstairs window of the room where the Gucci children were sleeping. She saw the giant take a deep breath, and woof, he blew through the trumpet. No noise came out, but it was obvious to Sophie that whatever had been in the jar had now been blown through the trumpet into the Gucci children's bedroom. What could it be? As the giant withdrew the trumpet from the window and bent down to pick up the suitcase, he happened to turn his head and glance across the street. In the moonlight, Sophie caught a glimpse of an enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face with the most enormous ears. The nose was as sharp as a knife, and above the nose there were two bright, flashing eyes, and the eyes were staring straight at Sophie. There was a fierce and devilish look in them. Sophie gave a yelp and pulled back from the window. She flew across the dormitory and jumped into her bed and hid under the blanket. And there she crouched, still as a mouse and tingling all over. Here's a picture of the big giant person looking in the window, but I'm not sure if you can really see it. It's kind of dark. Next chapter is called The Snatch. Under the blanket, Sophie waited. After a minute or so, she lifted the corner of the blanket and peeped out. For the second time that night, her blood froze to ice and she wanted to scream, but no sound came out. There at the window, with the curtains pushed aside, was the enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face of the giant person staring in. The flashing black eyes were fixed on Sophie's bed. The next moment, a huge hand with pale fingers came snaking in through the window. This was followed by an arm as thick as a tree trunk, and the arm, the hand, the fingers were reaching out across the room towards Sophie's bed. This time Sophie really did scream, but only for a second, because very quickly the huge hand clamped down over her blanket and the scream was smothered by the bedclothes. Sophie, crouching underneath the blanket, felt strong fingers grasping hold of her, and then she was lifted up from her bed, blanket and all, and whisked out of the window. If you can think of anything more terrifying than that happening to you in the middle of the night, then let's hear about it. The awful thing was that Sophie knew exactly what was going on, although she couldn't see it happening. She knew that a monster, or giant, with an enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face and dangerous eyes had plucked her from her bed in the middle of the witching hour and was now carrying her out through the window, smothered in a blanket. What actually happened next was this. When the giant had got Sophie outside, he arranged the blanket so that he could grasp all four corners of it all at once in one of his huge hands, with Sophie imprisoned inside. In the other hand, he seized the suitcase and a long trumpet thing, and off he ran. Sophie, by squirming around inside the blanket, managed to push the top of her head out through a little gap just below the giant's hand. She stared around her. She saw the village houses rushing by on both sides. The giant was sprinting down the high street. He was running so fast his black cloak was streaming out beside him like the wings of a bird. There's a picture of him running. And you can see he's got Sophie in the blanket in his hand. Each stride he took was as long as a tennis court. Out of the village he ran, and soon they were racing across the moonlit fields. The hedges dividing the fields were no problem to the giant. He simply strode over them. A wide river appeared in his path. He crossed it in one flying stride. Sophie crouched in the blanket, peering out. She was being bumped against the giant's leg like a sack of potatoes. Over the fields and hedges and rivers they went, and after a while a frightening thought came into Sophie's head. The giant is running fast, she told herself, because he is hungry and he wants to get home as quickly as possible, and then he'll have me for his breakfast. Next chapter is called The Cave. The giant ran on, but now a curious change took place in his way of running. He seemed suddenly to go into a higher gear. Faster and faster he went, and soon he was traveling at such a speed that the landscape became blurred. The wind stung Sophie's cheeks. It made her eyes water. It whipped her head back and whistled in her ears. She could no longer feel the giant's feet touching the ground. She had a weird sensation they were flying. It was impossible to tell whether they were over land or sea. The giant had some sort of magic in his legs. The wind rushing against Sophie's face became so strong that she had to duck down again into the blanket to prevent her head from being blown away. Was it really possible that they were crossing oceans? It certainly felt that way to Sophie. She crouched in the blanket and listened to the howling of the wind. It went on for what seemed like hours. Then all at once, the wind stopped its howling. The pace began to slow down. Sophie could feel the giant's feet pounding once again over the earth. She poked her head up out of the blanket to have a look. They were in a country of thick forests and rushing rivers. The giant had definitely slowed down and was now running more normally, although normal was a silly word to use to describe a galloping giant. He leapt over a dozen rivers. He went rattling through a great forest, then down into a valley, and up over a range of hills as bare as concrete. And soon he was galloping over a desolate wasteland that was not quite of this earth. The ground was flat and pale and yellow. Great lumps of blue rock were scattered around. Here's a picture of the giant running into the strange land. And dead trees stood everywhere like skeletons. The moon had long since disappeared, and now the dawn was breaking. Sophie, still peering out from her blanket, saw suddenly ahead of her a great craggy mountain. The mountain was dark blue, and all around it the sky was gushing and glistening with light. Bits of pale gold were flying among delicate frosty white flakes of cloud, and over to one side the rim of the morning sun was coming up red as blood. Right beneath the mountain the giant stopped. He was puffing mightily. His great chest was heaving in and out. He paused to catch his breath. Directly in front of them, lying against the side of the mountain, Sophie could see a massive round stone. It was as big as a house. The giant reached out and rolled the stone to one side as easily as if it had been a football, and now, where the stone had been, there appeared a vast black hole. The hole was so large the giant didn't even have to duck his head as he went in. He strode into the black hole, still carrying Sophie in one hand, the trumpet and the suitcase in the other. As soon as he was inside, he stopped and turned and rolled the great stone back into place so that the entrance to his secret cave was completely hidden from outside. Now that the entrance had been sealed up, there was not a glint of light inside the cave. All was black. Sophie felt herself being lowered to the ground. Then the giant let go of the blanket completely. His footsteps moved away. Sophie sat there in the dark, shivering with fear. "He is getting ready to eat me," she told herself. "He will probably eat me raw, just as I am. Or perhaps he will boil me first. Or he will have me fried. He will drop me like a rasher of bacon into some gigantic frying pan sizzling with fat." A blaze of light suddenly lit up the whole place. Sophie blinked and stared. Okay, so here's a picture of what Sophie sees when the light comes on in the cave. She saw an enormous cavern with a high rocky roof. The walls on either side were lined with shelves, and on the shelves there stood row upon row of glass jars. There were jars everywhere. They were piled up in the corners. They filled every nook and cranny of the cave. In the middle of the floor there was a table 12 feet high and a chair to match. The giant took off his black cloak and hung it against the wall. Sophie saw that under the cloak he was wearing a sort of collarless shirt and a dirty old leather waistcoat that didn't seem to have any buttons. His trousers were faded green and were far too short on the legs. On his bare feet he was wearing a pair of ridiculous sandals that for some reason had holes cut along each side, with a large hole at the end where his toes stuck out. Sophie, crouching on the floor of the cave in her nightie, gazed back at him through thick, steel-rimmed glasses. She was trembling like a leaf in the wind, and a finger of ice was running up and down the length of her spine. "Ha!" shouted the giant, walking forward and rubbing his hands together. "What has us got here?" His booming voice rolled around the walls of the cave like a burst of thunder. Next chapter is called the BFG. I think we're going to find out what the BFG stands for. The giant picked up the trembling Sophie with one hand and carried her across the cave and put her on the table. "Now he is really going to eat me," Sophie thought. The giant sat down and stared hard at Sophie. He had truly enormous ears. Each one was as big as the wheel of a truck, and he seemed to be able to move them inwards and outwards from his head as he wished. "I is hungry," the giant boomed. He grinned, showing massive square teeth. The teeth were very white and very square, and they sat in his mouth like huge slices of white bread. "Please don't eat me," Sophie stammered. The giant let out a bellow of laughter. "Just because I is a giant, you think I is a man-gobbling cannibal?" he shouted. "You is about right. Giants is all cannibally and murderful, and they does gobble up human beings. We is in giant country now. Giants is everywhere around. Out there us has the famous bone-crunching giant. Bone-crunching giant crunches up 2 wopsy-whiffling human beings for supper every night. Noise is ear-bursting. Noise of crunching bones goes crackety-crack for miles around." "Ouch," Sophie said. "Bone-crunching giant only gobbles human beings." "From Turkey," the giant said. "Every night Bone Cruncher is galloping off to Turkey to gobble Turks." Sophie's sense of patriotism was suddenly so bruised by this remark that she became quite angry. "Why Turks?" she blurted out. "What's wrong with the English?" "Bone-crushing giant says Turks is tasting ever so much juicier and more scrumdiddlicious. Bone Cruncher says Turkish human beings has a glamourly flavor. He says Turks from Turkey is tasting of turkey." "I suppose they would," Sophie said. "Of course they would," the giant shouted. "Every human being is diddly and different. Some is scrumdiddlyumptious and some is ucky slush. Greeks is all full of ucky slush. No giant is eating Greeks ever." "Why not?" Sophie asked. Greeks from Greece is all tasting greasy," the giant said. "I imagine that's possible too," Sophie said. She was wondering with a bit of a tremble what all this talking about eating people was leading up to. Whatever happened, she simply must play along with this peculiar giant and smile at his jokes. But were they jokes? Perhaps the great brute was just working up an appetite by talking about food. As I am saying, the giant went on, all human beings is having different flavors. Human beings from Panama is tasting very strong of hats. Why hats? Sophie said. You is not very clever, the giant said, moving his great ears in and out. I thought all human beings is full of brains, but your head is emptier than a bundongle. Do you like vegetables? Sophie asked. Here's a picture of Sophie talking to the giant. She's sitting on his table. You see her? Do you like vegetables? Sophie asked, hoping to steer the conversation towards a slightly less dangerous kind of food. You is trying to change the subject, the giant said sternly. We is having an interesting babblement about the taste of the human being. The human being is not a vegetable. Oh, but the bean is a vegetable, Sophie said. Not the human beings, the giant said. The human being has 2 legs, and a vegetable has no legs at all. Sophie didn't argue anymore. The last thing she wanted to do was make the giant cross. The human being, the giant went on, is coming in dillions of different flavors. For instance, human beings from Wales is tasting very whooshy of fish. There is something very fishy about whales. You mean whales, Sophie said. Whales is something quite different. Whales is whales, the giant said. Don't gobble funk around with words. I will now give you another example. Human beings from Jersey has a most disgustable woolly tickle on the tongue, the giant said. Human beings from Jersey is tasting of cardigans. You mean jerseys, Sophie said. You are once again gobble funking, the giant shouted. Don't do it. This is a serious and snitching subject. May I continue? Please do, Sophie said. Danes from Denmark is tasting ever so much of dogs, the giant went on. Of course, Sophie said. They taste of Great Danes. Wrong, cried the giant, slapping his thigh. Danes from Denmark is tasting doggy because they is tasting of Labradors. Then what do the people of Labrador taste of? Sophie asked. Danes, the giant cried triumphantly. Great Danes. Aren't you getting a bit mixed up? Sophie said. I is a very mixed up giant, the giant said, but I does do my best, and I is not nearly as mixed up as the other giants. I know one who gallops all the way to Wellington for his supper. There's another picture of them chatting. Wellington, Sophie said. Where is Wellington? Your head is full of squashed flies, the giant says. Wellington is in New Zealand. The human beings in Wellington has an especially scrumdiddlyicious taste, so says the welly-eating giant. What do the people of Wellington taste like? Sophie asked. Boots, the giant says. Of course, Sophie said. I should have known. Sophie decided that this conversation had now gone on long enough. If she was going to be eaten, she'd rather get it over and done with right away than be kept hanging around any more. What sort of human beings do you eat? She asked, trembling. Me, shouted the giant, his mighty voice making the glass jars rattle on the shelves. Me gobbling up human beings? This I never. The others, yes. All the others is gobbling them up every night, but not me. I is a freaky giant. I is a nice and jumbly giant. I is the only nice and jumbly giant in giant country. I is the big, friendly giant. I is the BFG. What is your name? My name is Sophie, Sophie said, hardly daring to believe the good news she had just heard. Lucky for Sophie, the BFG doesn't like human beings. Next chapter is called The Giants. But if you are so nice and friendly, Sophie said, then why did you snatch me from my bed and run away with me? Because you saw me, the big friendly giant answered. If anyone has ever seen a giant, he or she must be taken away hip switch. Why? Asked Sophie. Well, first of all, said the BFG, human beings is not really believing in giants, is they? Human beings is not thinking we exist. I do, Sophie said. Ah, but that is only because you have seen me, cried the BFG. I cannot possibly allow anyone, even little girls, to be seeing me and staying at home. The first thing you would be doing, you'd be scuttling around, yodeling the news that you were actually seeing a giant. And then a great giant hunt, a mighty giant look-see, would be starting up all over the world, with the human beings all rummaging for the great giant you saw and getting wildly excited. People would be coming rushing and bushing after me with goodness knows what, and they would be catching me and locking me into a cage to be stared at. They would be putting me into the zoo or the bum-bum house with all those squiggly hippo dumplings and crocodile windleys. Sophie knew that what the giant said was true. If any person reported actually having seen a giant haunting the streets of a town at night, there would most certainly be a terrific hullabaloo across the world. I will bet you, the BFG went on, that you would have been splashing the news all over the wonky world, wouldn't you, if I hadn't wiggled you away? I suppose I would, Sophie said. And that would never do, said the BFG. So what will happen to me now? Sophie asked. If you do go back, you will be telling the world, said the BFG, most likely on the telly bumpkin box and the radio squeaker. So you will just have to be staying here with me for the rest of your life. Oh no, cried Sophie. Oh yes, said the BFG, but I am warning you not ever to go whiffling out about this cave without I is with you, or you will be coming to an mucky end. I is showing you now who is going to eat you up if they is ever catching even one tiny glimpse of you. The big friendly giant picked Sophie off the table and carried her to the cave entrance. He rolled the huge stone to one side and said, "Peep out over there, little girl, and tell me what you is seeing." Sophie, sitting on the BFG's hand, peeped out of the cave. The sun was up now and shining fiery hot over the great yellow wasteland with its blue rocks and dead trees. "Is you seeing them?" the BFG asked. Sophie, squinting through the glare of the sun, saw several tremendous tall figures moving among the rocks. Here's a picture of what Sophie is seeing. About 500 yards away, 3 or 4 others were sitting quite motionless on the rocks themselves. "This is giant country," the BFG said. "Those is all giants, every one." It was a brain-boggling sight. The giants were all naked except for a sort of short skirt around their waists, and their skins were burnt by the sun. But it was the sheer size of each of them that boggled Sophie's brain the most. They were simply colossal, far taller and wider than the big friendly giant upon whose hand she was now sitting, and oh, how ugly they were. Many of them had large bellies, all of them had long arms and big feet. They were too far away for their faces to be seen clearly, and perhaps that was a good thing. "What on earth are they doing?" Sophie asked. "Nothing," said the BFG. "They is just moocheling and foocheling around and waiting for the night to come. Then they will all be galloping off to places where people is living to find their suppers." "You mean to Turkey?" Sophie said. "Bone-crunching giant will be galloping to Turkey, of course," said the BFG. "But the others will be whiffling off to all sorts of flung-away places, like Wellington for the booty flavor, and Panama for the hatty taste. Every giant is having his own favorite hunting ground." "Do they ever go to England?" Sophie asked. "Often," said the BFG. "They say the English is tasting ever so wonderfully of crawd scallop." "I'm not sure I quite know what that means," Sophie said. "Meanings is not important," said the BFG. "I cannot be right all the time. Quite often I is left instead of right." "And are all those beastly giants over there really going off again tonight to eat people?" Sophie asked. "All of them is guzzling human beings every night," the BFG answered. "All of them excepting me. That is why you will be coming to an mucky end if any of them should ever be getting his gogglers over you. You would be swallowed up like a piece of frumpkin pie, all in one dollop." "But eating people is horrible," Sophie cried. "It's frightful. Why doesn't someone stop them?" "And who, please, is going to be stopping them?" asked the BFG. "Couldn't you?" said Sophie. "Never in a pig's whistle," cried the BFG. Sophie and the BFG talking again. All of those man-eating giants is enormous and very fierce. They is all at least 2 times my wideness and double my royal highness. Twice as high as you, cried Sophie. Easily that, said the BFG. You has seen them in the distance, but just wait till you get them close up. Those giants is all at least 50 feet tall, with huge muscles, and cockles alive, oh, I is the titchy one. I is the runt. 24 feet is puddle nuts in giant country. You mustn't feel bad about it, Sophie said. I think you are just great. Why, even your toes must be as big as sausages. Bigger, said the BFG, looking pleased. They is as big as bumplehammers. How many giants are there out there? Sophie asked. 9 altogether, answered the BFG. That means, said Sophie, that somewhere in the world every single night 9 wretched people get carried away and eaten alive. More, said the BFG. It is all depending, you see, on how big the human beings is. Japanese beans is very small, so a giant will need to gobble up about 6 Japanese before he is feeling full. Others, like the Norway people and the Yankee Doodles, is ever so much bigger, and usually 2 or 3 of those makes a good tuck-in. But do these disgusting giants go to every single country in the world? Sophie asked. All countries excepting Greece is getting visited sometime or another, the BFG answered. The country which a giant visits is depending on how he is feeling. If it is very warm weather and a giant is feeling hot as a sizzle pan, he will probably go galloping far up to the Frisbee North to get himself an Eskimo or 2 to cool him down. A nice fat Eskimo to a giant is like a lovely ice cream lolly to you. I'll take your word for it, Sophie said. And then again, if it is a frosty night and the giant is frigidly with cold, he will probably point his nose towards the sweltering hotlands to guzzle a few Hottentots to warm him up. How perfectly horrible, Sophie said. Nothing hots a cold giant up like a hot Hottentot, the BFG said. And if you were to put me down on the ground and I was to walk out among them now, Sophie said, would they really eat me up? Like a whiff's whittle, cried the BFG. And what is more, you is so small they wouldn't even have to chew you. The first one to be seen you would pick you up in his fingers and down you go like a drop of drain water. Let's go back inside, Sophie said. I hate even watching them. All right, you guys, that is the end of my reading for today. I hope you enjoyed the story, the beginning of the story. I'm excited to see what happens next with Sophie and the BFG. And I'm curious what those bottled jars are that he has all over his cave. So let's see what happens next time. Until next time, thanks guys. It was great spending time with you.